From the i24 News Studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Shayna Estulin.
A country that was once called the breadbasket of Africa and then suffered for decades under a tyrant is now trying to move towards true democracy, but Zimbabwe is having a very rough transition.
Deadly clashes have now erupted following a presidential election this week. There have been riots, aggressive efforts by the army to tamp things down, and fires in the streets.
Authorities say at least 3 protesters on this day were killed. The presidential contest involved 23 candidates, but the main race was between Nelson Chamisa, a 40-year-old lawyer and pastor, and 75-year-old Emerson Mnangagwa. He helped engineer the downfall of former leader Robert Mugabe.
A spokesperson for the opposition is denouncing the government's decision to deploy the military to break up the riots.
Civilians are allowed to demand the respect of their rights in a lawful manner. Any disorder may be dealt with by the police, who are best trained for public order. Soldiers are trained to kill during war. We are seriously made to wonder what this means. Are we in war? Are civilians the enemy of the state? The loss of lives is the most painful experience we ever get subjected to.
European Union observers in Zimbabwe are reporting voting irregularities and are calling for the election results to be released as soon as possible. And let's discuss now with Craig Snyder, the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia.
Thanks.
And thanks, Nina. And let's take a broader view here. What happens to the rest of the continent if there's continued violence and chaos in Zimbabwe?
Well, it certainly sets things back. There's been progress in Africa in recent years, both economically and politically in terms of democratic stabilization in lots of parts of the continent. On the other hand, there are more than 50 African states, and everyone is an individual nation. And not all are moving in the same direction at the same time. Zimbabwe has been a particularly difficult case because of the dictatorship of Mugabe.
Craig, there's around the world, at least businesses see such great economic opportunities to make money in the continent of Africa, perhaps even more so than any other continent over the next decade. Does that still seem to be the case? Is there still that optimism despite what happens here in Zimbabwe or other problems in South Africa or other pockets around the continent?
Again, I think it's really one country at a time. You can't generalize about the whole continent. In both West Africa and in parts of East Africa, south of the Sahara, there's been real progress. And along the Atlantic coast in West Africa, you've had some of the fastest growing economies in the world over the last decade since the financial crisis in the Western world. But it's certainly not universal across the whole continent. What happens in Zimbabwe is important because, as you said in your opening, this is a country that was seen when it achieved independence from Britain in 1980 to have some of the greatest economic and political potential on the continent, and in fact went so far in the other direction. It's been one of the worst spots in terms of loss of life of civilians at the hands of their own government, and just a terrible economic situation. Even now, in Zimbabwe, there is a liquidity crisis, a crash crisis, where ordinary citizens have no currency of any kind, neither foreign nor local, to spend, and are forced to barter just to stay alive. So whichever party emerges, and the likelihood is that it's going to be the ruling party, because the likelihood is that this election is fixed, you're going to see a need for the international community to decide whether or not to deal with Zimbabwe's debts or to continue to have the country really struggle economically.
So, as you said, if Mugabe's successor stays in power, do you expect the opposition to go quietly into the night, or do you think this could potentially break out into something even bigger than just riots on the street?
Well, there certainly is that potential. I guess what would determine the course is whether or not this successor government is willing to be as brutal as Mugabe was. There were at least 3 times, basically once a decade over the last 3 decades, in which Mugabe and his military engaged in harsh crackdowns against dissent, in which thousands, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Would that happen with his successor? Would the international community stand by today, as it did in previous decades, to allow that to happen? Those are open questions. So they might want to rule with the kind of iron hand that Mugabe did, but they may not be able to, either domestically or internationally. I do not think that the opposition is going to go quietly into the night. They're either going to be given a real seat at the table, a democratic table, or they would have to be suppressed very violently.
Craig, given that view of the opposition and what they may do, what should the U.S. policy and, frankly, the policy of the European Union and others around the world be?
Well, I think the West has to continue to stand for genuine democracy. And when we see a charade, we have to call it that. People are talking about voting irregularities in this election on the actual period of the balloting. That's the least of it. The election was rigged from the beginning. The government created a biometric voter roll that was supposed to be for security, but really was to exclude certain people from being able to vote in the first place. It created no mechanism for Zimbabweans who live outside the country to be able to participate in the election. And that's fully 1/5 of all the Zimbabweans there are in the world live outside the country, and understandably, they would have most likely gone against the regime. So this thing was really rigged, and I think the United States has to continue its long-standing tradition by presidents of both parties of standing up for genuine democracy and against attempts to have a sort of a theater of democracy that's not real.
Craig Snyder, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Craig, thanks as always for joining us. We appreciate it.